Shocking revelations from newly unsealed court documents give us a closer look into the Delphi double murder case, for the first time revealing how the two Indiana teenagers were killed. Plus, the accused killer Richard Allen confesses to the murders on multiple occasions before exhibiting bizarre behaviors in his jail cell. For nearly 6 years, this video was the only clue the public had in the unsolved murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. On February 13, 2017, the 13 and 14-year-old girls were hiking on a trail in Delphi, Indiana. They then disappeared. The next day, their bodies were discovered in the woods nearby. The video was taken by one of the victims the day she was murdered and released to the public as investigators searched for more information. Officials now say the man in the video was Richard Allen. Since his arrest in October of last year, he's allegedly confessed to the double homicide.
And for me, the biggest thing was these documents gave us more context into these so-called confessions we've been hearing so much about. Before yesterday, we knew nothing about the situations where he made these so-called incriminating statements or confessions. Some people said that for all we know, they may have been statements that were overheard by fellow inmates. They may have come from jailhouse informants. But now we know where they were made. They were made in phone calls between Richard Allen and his wife and his mother. And furthermore, we know that those calls where he made these statements were recorded.
It was really surprising and frankly kind of, it was shocking because you're like, okay, there's the ballistics evidence. We're going to have dueling experts on that. We have him placing himself at the scene, which is definitely problematic, but does not mean that he's placing himself at the murder scene. The gun does that. But other than that, what's the shape of the case? And if on top of that, he's confessing to it, that seems like a hurdle the defense will have to overcome.
Kevin Greenlee and Anya Kane, creators of the Murder Sheet podcast, are partially to thank for the release of nearly 120 unsealed documents. The pair have been following the Delphi case for years, even before Allen was arrested.
One thing that always stuck with me about the case is I remember talking with my mom about it, and I have sisters who are not super far away in age from Abby and Libby, like they're in that generation. And like, just the idea of these two girls who are best friends having a lovely day and enjoying each other's company and going out like for what kids do, like a walk on the trails. That's so normal. That's so appalling that they did not come back from that and that their families as a result don't get to see them grow up. It's horrific. It's enraging. And so the case always stuck with me because of that. And because like, okay, we have this guy on video footage. Why are there no answers?
Greenlee and Kane say they were pleasantly surprised this week when Judge Francis Gull ordered hundreds of pages of documents be released to the public.
There's actually a process in Indiana for documents to be sealed. And basically that would involve either the prosecutor or the defense filing a request with the court saying there's something in here, whether for privacy concerns or investigative concerns, that really needs to be withheld from the public. But in this case, things were being sealed even though those requests were not being filed. And so people behind the scenes were saying this isn't right, this process isn't being followed, these things should be made public. We prepared a motion basically asking the judge, can you unseal some of these documents that were improperly sealed? And we were really pleased that she looked upon that motion favorably and released all those documents yesterday.
Upon reading the documents, Allen's alleged confessions stuck out to Greenlee and Kane and to Law&Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman.
So absolutely, it's always interesting, certainly as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, to hear time and time again a defendant make statements while they're incarcerated to someone who on the phone. And the reason we're always so shocked is because everybody knows those calls are being monitored and taped. And yet he still managed to make statements that incriminated himself. And so there is no question that the prosecution is going to hone in on those statements and any other statements he may have made to any other individual in which there's any indication of culpability.
Rendelman says Allen's conversations and alleged confessions will likely be used by prosecutors at trial.
Certainly, anyone who heard the statements made by Richard Allen can be called to testify. But in the case, for example, of the phone call from jail, they don't need the wife in order to testify. They can simply call an individual who works at the facility to explain how the phone system works, the fact that the phone was being used by Richard Allen at that time, and establish that the phone number that he called or spoke with was in fact his wife. They don't need her because they have the actual audio tape of what he said.
According to the newly released court documents, Allen admitted to the murders to both his wife and his mother. On April 3rd, when he made the confession to his wife, she quickly hung up the phone.
Finding out the context of these confessions or these incriminating statements is surprising, because we're hearing it's not a jailhouse snitch, it's not a police officer interrogating him, it's to his wife and mother. It's to the two women who have supported him throughout all this whole mess. And so hearing that it happened in that context, the defense's side of things is that he's having a mental breakdown and he's deteriorating because of prison conditions. So you can see that side of it where someone might be out of control, even if they're innocent. But on the prosecution side, he has no real reason to just unilaterally confess to his two biggest supporters. So it's going to be something for the defense to definitely overcome that hurdle, and for the prosecution to kind of continue pushing the narrative that we have the right guy.
And I think it's interesting also to learn what happened after these so-called confessions. It says in the documents that Kathy Allen ended the phone call abruptly. And after that, Richard Allen seems to have gone into some sort of mental and emotional tailspin.
Following these confessions, Allen's defense alleged his mental health issues really ramped up. Court docs say he began, quote, wetting down paperwork he had gotten from his attorneys and eating it. Allen also refused to sleep and purposely broke a tablet that allowed him to send texts and listen to music.
He has this tablet which he uses to communicate with the outside world. He's been making an average of 1 or 2 calls a day. After this, he breaks it. He stops wanting to eat. He stops wanting to sleep. And he begins doing bizarre things. One thing mentioned in the documents is that he takes his legal paperwork, he wets it, and he eats it. And all of this stuff is going on right after this call with his wife, where he basically, according to the documents, confessed.
Gross and disturbing, and just also puts into some context, the defense was complaining that he wasn't getting his paperwork, but the prison officials may have just been concerned he was literally going to consume it. So it's really it's just bizarre and upsetting, to think someone's at that level of mental degradation. But at the same time, the question is this an innocent man with some mental health concerns who's having a breakdown, or is this a guilty man who's overwhelmed by that guilt?
Allen's defense attorneys allege his, quote, mental state has declined because Westville Correctional Facility is unfit and that he should be moved, even comparing Allen's treatment to a prisoner of war. Court documents reveal Allen is being held in a 12-by-8 cell where he is, quote, housed in that unit for his protection after making suicidal statements.
And they're trying. They're saying he was mentally unraveling at the time because of poor prison conditions. And so they'll be able to make that argument to basically say he was not competent. This is not true. He's just saying this because he's kind of losing it. And so I definitely understand their case there. But to me also, I think it would have been easier to dismiss the confessions if it was to maybe a detective who was doing a harsh interrogation and he's losing his cool and he maybe says something sarcastic. Or if it's like a jailhouse snitch who, can you really trust their word? But to his wife and mother, who of course have been supporting him in public court hearings, being there for him, he's telling them that. I can't imagine that they were pressing him very hard.
Allen's defense, quote, challenged that his treatment was unconstitutional, arguing his so-called confessions can't be taken seriously given his mental state.
We've seen pictures of Richard Allen both before and after he was incarcerated. I think there's no question that he has certainly lost a lot of weight, and that may be indicative of some breakdown or deterioration in terms of his mental health. And I think the defense is going to use that in saying he wasn't of mental stable mind when he made those statements or confessions to his loved ones, and therefore a jury cannot rely on them.
Prosecutors have pushed back on this theory, though, noting that Allen was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists on April 14th after his alleged confessions. The medical professionals determined Allen did not need to be moved, and court documents note his behavior went back to normal after this evaluation. But besides Allen's behavior on the inside, court documents also reveal what investigators recovered from his home when a search warrant was executed last fall.
But there's a document called the search warrant return, and that spells out everything they seized and they took from the Allen residence. So it was very interesting to see exactly what they took. We know obviously that they took a gun. I don't think we realized how many guns he had. He also had knives, and of course they also took many items of clothing. And one thing from that search warrant return that jumped out at me was they actually removed a little swatch underneath the spare tire in his car for testing. And so I'm curious, what was it they saw there that they thought needed to be tested? And have those tests been done? And if so, what are the results of those tests?
Among the items recovered from Allen's home, a .40 caliber handgun cartridges, a memory card, some boots, a Carhartt coat, jeans, and 13 knives. As Law&Crime Network previously reported, Allen was first interviewed by an Indiana conservation officer back in 2017. He stayed off police radar for years, though, until that initial interview was rediscovered in September 2022, which led to the execution of a search warrant in October 2022 and Allen's arrest.
He comes up initially in 2017, and, he volunteers information to a Department of Natural Resources investigator and says, hey, I was on the trails that day.
Back in 2017, Allen admitted to police he was near the High Bridge the day the girls were murdered, saying he was wearing a Carhartt jacket and blue jeans. Investigators later reported a bullet recovered at the crime scene previously cycled through a gun that belonged to Allen. But what may be the most shocking thing from the newly unsealed court documents is the revelation that both girls were killed by a, quote, sharp object. However, according to Rendleman, we can't assume one of the knives recovered from Allen's home was used in the murders.
Anytime we hear a sharp object was used in a murder, we assume it's a knife. It could be other types of objects. However, we do know from some of the sources that we've been hearing from is that they've recovered numerous knives from the home of Richard Allen. So I tend to think that they believe those knives may be very probative in terms of the murder of these 2 young girls.
And while new evidence may look incriminating for Allen, Rendleman says his defense will work hard to convince jurors there is reasonable doubt.
I don't think I ever consider anything a slam dunk. This case is tough for a couple reasons. One is there's no eyewitnesses that establish that Richard Allen is the person that killed these young girls. There are pieces of circumstantial evidence that establish that he was there. And there are pieces of circumstantial evidence that if you put together, make out a fairly strong case that Richard Allen was the person responsible. But I think that the defense has and is going to be able to work on some of the holes that exist with some of the lack of evidence, at least to raise some reasonable doubt to the jury.
Right now, Allen is being held on $20 million bond. He's pleaded not guilty to the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. He's set to go to trial on January 8th of next year. Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Sierra Gillespie.